we know the Kerch bridge is probably the Achilles heel of Russia. It's so much in the sights for Ukraine to attack, and so likely that it will do at some stage that would really cut the head off the Crimea snake. Now, as you mentioned, the Black Sea Fleet has gone. There is virtually no naval presence in the Black Sea now, which gives Ukraine freedom of maneuver, which will be critical. The big question is, could they break through the Surovikin line, the defensive lines, which have been so difficult at the moment? And if they can, I think, yes, they certainly could take Crimea.
And of what is included in the aid package, and we don't know the full shopping list, as it were, is it the ATACMS that you think will be the most crucial?
Well, the ATACMS are what we call a strategic weapon. In other words, they have the opportunity to hit strategic targets. These are targets that can have a demonstrative effect on the way that the Russian wages war, and particularly the sort of logistic support. So attacking the rail hubs, the roads, bridges. I think it's no secret that Ukraine intends to take out the Kerch bridge, the main bridge from Russia into Crimea, where a lot of their military hardware flows. So that is why the ATACMS is so crucial. But also, it's just the amount of artillery ammunition and tank ammunition which Ukraine has been, really suffering with not having. I mean, the Russians are firing 10 artillery rounds to every one Ukrainian at the moment. And, as we've discussed before, and as we're seeing on the front, mass has a real quality of its own. And, although we thought this was sort of First World War type usage rates, actually the trench warfare in the Donbass is virtually similar, virtually no difference to the trench warfare in Passchendaele and the Somme, well over 100 years ago. So, yeah, just that weight of ammunition is key as well as the smart stuff.
I wanted to ask you, Hamish, about how realistic you think it is for Ukraine to one day recapture Crimea. I was speaking yesterday on Frontline to Michael Binion, who's been with the Times since 1972 as a foreign correspondent, columnist, leader writer. He knows his stuff, and he was quite pessimistic about Ukraine ever recapturing Crimea. And I put the counter argument that if you look at the success that Ukraine has had at eliminating much of the Black Sea Fleet, if you look at the way they've been targeting the Kerch Bridge, that actually it may not necessarily be out of the question. Where do you stand on that?
Well, this is a really interesting point. I think what Ukraine has done is, in military terms, we call it preparing the battlefield. So from a strategic perspective, preparing the battlefield to attack Crimea has gone pretty well. They have hit a lot of targets deep in Crimea, a lot of airfields, taken down a lot of some of the Russians' top fighter jets and bombers. They have made a lot of them move out of Crimea, and they've interdicted a lot of refineries, ammunition dumps, not only in Crimea but also in Russia. We know the Kerch bridge is probably the Achilles heel of Russia. It's so much in the sights for Ukraine to attack, and so likely that it will do at some stage that would really cut the head off the Crimea snake. Now, as you mentioned, the Black Sea Fleet has gone. There is virtually no naval presence in the Black Sea now, which gives Ukraine freedom of maneuver, which will be critical. The big question is, could they break through the Surovikin line, the defensive lines, which have been so difficult at the moment? And if they can, I think, yes, they certainly could take Crimea. And whether that will help quicken the end of the war or not is a case to consider. But I don't think taking Crimea is completely out of the question. And, it could be a very key sort of element in the future to get some sort of meaningful peace. So yeah, I would say Crimea is up for grabs, and if Ukraine gets all the kit that it needs, that it's coming through now, it might be in a better position to do that. And if it gets the Ukraine Iron Dome we've been talking about and gains air superiority, then yeah, again, it's another bit of the jigsaw, making it more likely. So I wouldn't write off Crimea at this stage.
Just to go back to the issue of the West taking the threat posed by Russia increasingly seriously. Obviously, we've seen last week, for example, the UK making a pledge to increase its defence spending by 2030, and there seems to be a general realisation that European countries do need to spend more on defence. Now, that doesn't necessarily help Ukraine, that's more to do with their own defence. But do you think we are seeing a tipping point now, Hamish, where there is more of a realisation that actually Russia does need to be confronted?
Well, this is a really, really interesting point. I think until quite recently, defence was not an election issue, and the election in this country and the election in the States in November is the big elephant in the room. If people don't see defence as an issue, then it could go very badly wrong. And I think both the main parties have now realised that actually. And I think I've written recently, instead of going to the polling booths in November, we could all be going to the recruitment centres to pick up our kit to go and fight in Europe. So there, hopefully, and it's a great thing that Frontline pushes this and keeps it in the news. Hopefully, people in the country are realising that war in Europe is not a distant possibility. I wouldn't say it's the most likely possibility, but it is possible. And the more we ignore it, the more likelihood it will happen. As people are talking, we're in a pre-war phase at the moment. The way in a pre-war phase to prevent war is to show to your enemy that you are preparing for it, you are stronger than them, and you will, follow through your actions. Until very recently, I think Putin has looked at us and looked at our conventional deterrence and has not been deterred. And we've got a catch up to do. We have paid lip service to our conventional deterrence since the end of the Cold War, whereas Putin has done absolutely the opposite. Now, we have been caught napping. What on earth? And it's a political thing, I'm afraid. It's one sees, and I'm sure you discuss it all the time, people are generally more concerned about climate change. They're more concerned about the cost of living crisis. They're more concerned about what's happening in Gaza. But they're not seeing what's happening on their doorstep, that actually all those things, if we get the defense wrong and don't have a credible conventional deterrence, those things could be horrifically irrelevant because we will be at war. And what we must absolutely do, and for somebody like myself who spent the last 35 years of my life on the battlefields of the world, I've seen war and you don't want it. You've got to avoid it if at all possible. And we are only just waking up to it. And let's hope we're not too late.
Just finally, Hamish, we're having this conversation at the end of April. What does a good May look like for Ukraine?
Well, a good May is the front lines not moving any more than we're seeing at the moment. A good May sees the F-16s arriving and creating, with all the other air defense and the long-range missiles, some sort of air superiority for Ukraine. Because once Ukraine has air superiority, it can start maneuvering on the ground. Now, I don't think that's going to start happening in May, but I think the psychological message that it will send out to the Ukrainian people who have felt for the last 6 months, they felt on their own. They say, well, why should young kids in Ukraine fight when America and everybody else isn't giving them the hard way to do it? So a good May is a rebuilding of morale in Ukraine and getting them back on the front foot rather than purely on the defensive. And a bad May would be a significant Russian incursion and offensive. And a bad May would have us all really looking at the potential to fight the Russians ourselves. So let's hope that the good May happens and not the bad May.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.